The ballroom had gone silent in the particular way that only happens when cruelty is performed in public. Every glass paused, every conversation extinguished, 200 people collectively holding their breath while James Hartwell dismantled his wife in front of them with the calm precision of a man who had decided that humiliation was cleaner than honesty. Nadia stood in the wreckage of it and did not break. She turned, she walked, she held her chin at exactly the angle that told every watching face that she had not been destroyed, and then she stepped through the glass doors into the cold London night and found a convoy of black vehicles waiting, and men who bowed, and a name she had never been allowed to carry spoken aloud for the first time, and a grandfather with guilt in his eyes and an empire at his back, and portrait after portrait of her own face looking down from walls that had always been hers. She learned who she was. She built what she was owed. The Harrington Grand Hotel occupied an entire city block in the heart of the financial district, its marble facade a declaration of old money and quiet ambition. Inside, the annual charity gala attracted London's most powerful, those who had built empires and those who had inherited them. Among the glittering crowd stood Nadia Sinclair, her forest green gown concealing a truth that had been pressing against her ribs for 3 months. She was carrying a child she had not yet revealed to anyone. She had practiced the words countless times in the mirror of her modest apartment, searching for the right arrangement of syllables that might soften what she feared would be an unwelcome announcement. James Hartwell, her husband of 2 years, was not a man who welcomed surprises. He was meticulous, calculated, a man who mapped every decision on spreadsheets and measured warmth only in terms of utility. She had married him believing she could reach something human beneath his cold exterior. It had been a quiet, persistent hope, not yet extinguished, but flickering dangerously. The evening had started pleasantly enough. She circled the room, smiled at the right faces, raised her glass without drinking. Then she heard her name across the ballroom, not spoken with warmth, but weaponized. "Here she is," James announced to a cluster of associates, his voice carrying over the orchestra. "My wife, the woman who apparently has no concept of honesty." He was impeccably dressed, as always, but something in his posture had shifted. He had the look of a man who had decided something. Nadia moved toward him, instinct urging her to manage the moment quietly. "James, perhaps we should step outside." "Why?" he interrupted, his words precise, cutting through the ambient music. "So you can continue the performance? I know what you've been hiding. I had you followed." The room around them compressed, heads turned, conversations dissolved. "This marriage is finished," he said, quietly enough for decorum, yet loudly enough for those nearby to absorb every syllable. "You are an embarrassment, and I will not be bound to someone who operates in shadows." The words struck with physical force. Nadia stood completely still, refusing to let her expression collapse in front of an audience who would replay this moment at dinner parties for months. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, but she held herself together with the discipline of someone long practiced at enduring pain quietly. She turned without responding and walked toward the exit, her chin level, her steps measured. Just as her hand reached the door handle, she became aware of a commotion outside, the deep rumble of engines, the sharp snap of boots on cobblestone. Through the glass panels, she watched a convoy of polished vehicles arrive with the quiet authority of an institution that did not need to announce itself. Men in dark suits descended with swift precision. The lead figure approached her directly, and when his gaze found hers, he inclined his head with unmistakable respect. "Miss Wentworth," he said, using a name she had not heard in years, "your grandfather has requested your return. The family has waited long enough." Behind her, she heard the hush that ripples through a crowd when the world rearranges itself without warning. James Hartwell had gone very still. Nadia Sinclair, or rather Nadia Wentworth, stepped through the doors into the cold evening air and did not look back. The Wentworth estate unfolded across the Cotswold landscape like a secret the countryside had been keeping for centuries. Ancient stone walls draped in dormant ivy rose against a sky just beginning to lighten toward dawn. The grounds were immaculate in the particular way that requires armies of invisible labor, and the main house, Ashbourne Hall, possessed the quiet grandeur of a place that had never needed to prove anything to anyone. Nadia arrived just before sunrise, stepping from the vehicle into air that smelled of frost and old grass. She had not slept. Emotion had given way to a strange numbness during the drive, and she had spent the hours watching motorway lights blur past while her mind attempted to reassemble the fragments of the evening into something coherent. A housekeeper led her through corridors lined with portraits she was told were her ancestors, faces carrying her own bone structure, her own particular way of holding the jaw. She studied them as she passed, feeling the peculiar dislocation of encountering a history that had always been hers but had been deliberately kept from her. Her grandfather, Edmund Wentworth, waited in the East Library. At 81, he carried his years with the gravity of someone accustomed to long views. His silver hair was smoothed back, his eyes, deep amber and alert, rising to meet hers as she entered. "You came," he said simply. "I didn't feel I had much choice," Nadia replied, sinking into the chair across from him, "though I'd appreciate an explanation for why I've spent my entire adult life as someone else." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother chose to leave," he began. "She fell in love with a man we considered unsuitable. After she died, I arranged for you to be cared for under a different name. There were rivals who would have used you as leverage against this family. It was protection." "It was erasure," Nadia said. He nodded slowly. "Yes, and I have lived with that distinction for a long time." He leaned forward. "But you are here now. You are the heir to everything this family has built across 4 generations. I am not asking you to forgive me immediately. I am asking you to understand what you are." Over the following days, Nadia learned the shape of that inheritance. She met the family's chief advisor, Priya, who walked her through the Wentworth portfolio, property, finance, media, philanthropy, with the patience of someone who had clearly prepared for this briefing for years. The scale was staggering, not merely in financial terms, but in the quiet influence the family had accumulated through strategic generosity and long institutional memory. Nadia absorbed it carefully, asking questions that surprised Priya with their precision. She had spent years in financial analysis before her marriage, skills that had once been her primary identity before James had slowly repositioned her as an appendage of his ambitions. In the evenings, she walked the estate grounds alone, her hand occasionally resting on the curve of her belly. The daughter growing inside her, the secret she had not yet shared with anyone at Ashbourne Hall. She was not ready. There were things she needed to understand about herself before she could explain them to others. But beneath the grief and confusion and the enormous weight of revelation, something new was quietly taking root, a sense of solid ground beneath her feet that had never quite been there before. Ivy Pemberton arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced except for a brief message. "I heard what happened. Tell me everything. I'm outside with wine and absolutely no patience for 'I'm fine.'" Nadia had been standing at the tall library window watching a gardener trim hedges into geometric precision when the text arrived. For the first time in days, something in her chest loosened. She went downstairs and opened the front door to find her closest friend from university standing on the steps, a bag over one shoulder and 2 bottles of wine in her arms, her expression a careful mixture of outrage and fierce protective warmth. They settled on the east terrace as the afternoon light softened across the grounds. Ivy listened without interruption, an act of extraordinary generosity, because Ivy was constitutionally inclined towards strong opinions and rarely restrained them. But she seemed to sense that what Nadia needed first was simply to speak, to arrange the chaos of recent weeks into language. Nadia told her everything. The marriage, cold even at its best. James's methodical dismantling of her confidence over 2 years, so gradual she had almost mistaken it for her own personality. The pregnancy she had been concealing, the ballroom, the convoy, the grandfather, the portrait-lined corridors and the vast inheritance and the identity she was still learning to inhabit. When she finished, Ivy said, "I want to be honest, because you deserve it from someone without an agenda. You look different. Not broken. I expected broken. You look like someone who got a door slammed in their face and is realizing for the first time that the door was never worth knocking on." "I'm still angry," Nadia admitted. "You're allowed to be angry for a very long time," Ivy said. "But I think curiosity is what's actually driving you now. You're trying to figure out who you are without the story someone else told you about yourself." It was accurate enough to sting. Meanwhile, in the glass and steel tower of his London offices, James Hartwell was discovering the consequences of his public performance. Business relationships that had seemed solid were developing hairline fractures. Meetings were postponed, then quietly cancelled. A consortium he had been cultivating for 18 months withdrew without formal explanation. His assistant compiled a list of unreturned calls, and the list grew daily. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he called his own advisor, who sat across from him and said carefully, "James, you publicly humiliated the granddaughter of Edmund Wentworth. Whatever you thought you were doing, the market read it as extraordinary arrogance. And arrogance is the one thing no one in this industry forgives." James stared at the tabletop after the advisor left. He replayed the evening with the analytical detachment he applied to losing investments, searching for the precise point of miscalculation. He found it immediately. He had been so consumed by the sensation of being deceived that he had not paused to consider what he was about to lose. He had acted from fear dressed up as control. He poured a measure of whiskey and sat in his empty office as the city moved at its indifferent pace, and understood for the first time that he had destroyed the only relationship that had ever required him to be something other than effective. 3 months into her residence at Ashbourne Hall, Nadia began to feel the estate's rhythms become her own. She developed a morning routine, early walks along the property's outer boundary, a habit that had started as restlessness and evolved into something closer to meditation. The English countryside in late autumn was stark and honest in a way she found comforting. The stripped trees offered no decorative illusion, and the cold air required complete presence. Her work with Priya deepened steadily. What had begun as orientation expanded into genuine apprenticeship. Nadia brought instincts sharpened by years in financial analysis to questions about the portfolio, and more than once her observations prompted Priya to request further research from the broader team. Edmund attended these meetings with quiet attention and rarely spoke during sessions, but would occasionally pause Nadia in the corridor afterward to offer a single observation that invariably proved to be the most important thing anyone had said all day. "You think in systems," he told her one morning after she had outlined a restructuring proposal for one of the family's charitable foundations. "Your mother did too. It was her greatest strength and occasionally her most significant blind spot. She would see the logic of a structure so clearly that she sometimes forgot the people inside it." Nadia received this as both compliment and caution. She told Edmund about the baby on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her arrival. She had considered waiting longer, but the practical considerations of an advancing pregnancy were beginning to require decisions, and she had learned that Edmund responded better to facts presented calmly than to information withheld until it became unavoidable. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "A great-grandchild." "Yes." "James Hartwell's child?" "My child," Nadia said firmly. "She will know who her father is when she is old enough, but she is mine." Edmund looked at her with the expression she had been slowly learning to read, something between respect and a carefully managed grief for all the years they had not had. "She will be a Wentworth," he said, "if that is what you choose." "It is." He nodded, and for a moment something shifted in his face that might, with time, resolve into peace. Nadia began attending to practical matters with increasing confidence. She established a small office in the South Wing and started reviewing the family's philanthropic commitments with a view toward restructuring them more strategically. She brought in 2 external consultants and asked questions that occasionally left them temporarily speechless, not because they were unanswerable, but because they required the asker to have thought through several layers of implication before arriving at them. In the evenings, she and Ivy sat on the terrace with tea, talking about everything and nothing. They discussed the future with the particular combination of practicality and open-endedness that had always characterized their friendship. Nadia did not forgive James in those months, but she began to understand the architecture of her own decisions, the ways she had dismissed signs that in retrospect had been clear. Not to punish herself, but because understanding the pattern was the first step in dismantling it. She was building something new with deliberate care, and she wanted every part of the foundation to be honest.
The invitation arrived on a Monday, printed on heavy cream paper with the Wentworth crest embossed in the upper corner. The European Business Leadership Summit, sponsored by the Wentworth Consortium, would be held in Vienna. 3 days of panels, private meetings, and the kind of strategic networking that shaped entire industries for the following decade. Nadia reviewed the guest list with Priya and recognized the name immediately, James Hartwell. She studied it for a moment without expression. Priya, who was watching carefully, did not offer an opinion. "Is this deliberate?" Nadia asked. "Your grandfather does not do things by accident," Priya said. "And does he expect something specific from the encounter?" "I think he expects you to conduct yourself according to your own judgment," Priya replied. "He has had quite a long time to observe other people conduct themselves according to his, and the results have been mixed." It was the most candid thing Priya had said since Nadia's arrival, and Nadia appreciated it proportionally. Vienna in November was cold and architectural, a city that had decided centuries ago exactly what it intended to be and had declined all subsequent suggestions for revision. The summit was held at a private venue overlooking the river, its rooms filled with people who spoke in the careful, elliptical language of those for whom a misplaced word carried genuine consequence. Nadia moved through the first evening reception with an ease that had surprised even herself over recent months. She had come to understand that her time at Ashbourne Hall had not merely taught her the family business, it had taught her how to occupy space with authority. Not performance, authority. She saw James before he saw her. He was standing near the windows, nursing a drink, and even from across the room she could see the quality of his stillness. Not calm, but its careful impersonation. He had lost some weight. The sharp edges of his features, which had once projected command, now projected something closer to sleeplessness. When their eyes met, she held his gaze for one steady moment, then turned back to her conversation without haste. It was Ivy who found her later that evening in a quiet anteroom and said, "He keeps looking at you." "Most people do. That's rather the point of the summit." "You know what I mean." Nadia did know. She set down her glass. "I'm not interested in being his redemption story, Ivy. I know you're not, but I'm watching a man who appears genuinely dismantled, and I think you should decide consciously how you want to handle it rather than let the decision make itself." It was good advice. Nadia acknowledged it and went back to the reception. Later, when most guests had moved to the formal dinner, she found herself on the roof terrace, drawn there by cool air and faint music drifting from below. She stood at the low balustrade, looking at the city lights reflected in the river, when she heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She already knew who it was, and she needed one more quiet moment, just one, to settle herself before she decided how she intended to receive him and what she was willing to say.
"I almost didn't come up here," James said. "And yet," Nadia replied. She turned to face him. He looked worse than she had been prepared for, though she registered this without satisfaction. The composed architecture of his face had developed fault lines, and his eyes, which had always maintained the flat quality of someone refusing to be read, now held something unguarded and uncertain. "I need to tell you something," he began. "Before you do," Nadia interrupted, her voice steady, "I want to tell you something first, because it's relevant and because I'm not going to let it become leverage." She looked at him directly. "I am 7 months pregnant. We are having a daughter. I have made all decisions necessary for her well-being, and I will continue to do so. I am not telling you this to negotiate. I am telling you because she deserves a father who knows she exists, and what you do with that information is your own responsibility." The silence that followed was absolute. James had gone very still in the way of someone who has just encountered a fact so large it requires all available capacity simply to receive it. "Nadia, let me finish," she kept her voice level. "What you did at the gala was not merely unkind, it was a systematic dismantling, in public, of a person who had given you 2 years of genuine effort. I don't want your explanation tonight, and I am not prepared to receive your apology as though it resolves anything. What I want from you, if anything, is honesty, with yourself primarily. I spent considerable time trying to understand what drove you to do what you did, and the answer I arrived at is that you were frightened, of closeness, of the loss of control that intimacy requires, and you chose cruelty because it felt more manageable than vulnerability." James was quiet for a long time. The city spread out below them, indifferent and beautiful. "You're right," he said, finally. "Just that. No qualification, no defense." The simplicity of it caught her slightly off guard. She had expected argument. "I know I'm right. The question is whether you do." He moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, maintaining the distance the moment required. "My therapist, I began seeing someone 3 months ago, says I have spent my entire life conflating emotional investment with strategic vulnerability, that loving something meant handing someone the capacity to destroy you, and the only rational response was preemptive detachment." "It sounds like someone describing a wound, not justifying behavior," Nadia said. "It's not a justification." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying this to offer you comfort, James. I'm saying it because I want any conversation between us, whatever it becomes, to begin from an honest place, for our daughter's sake, if nothing else." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way he had rarely permitted himself during their marriage. "You've changed," he said. "I've become more myself. That's different." They stood together in the city's silence for several minutes, neither moving toward nor away from the other, simply occupying the strange, charged geography of a shared history that had not yet determined what it intended to become. The meeting took place in the offices of a neutral legal firm on a gray November morning, the sort of day that offered no emotional editorial, simply a flat, workmanlike light asking everyone present to focus on substance. Nadia arrived with Priya and a specialist solicitor named Marcus Webb, who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed every conceivable variation of human complexity across a long career. James arrived with Eleanor Crane, his chief commercial advisor, and, as Nadia had learned, the person in his professional life most capable of honest counsel. The documents covered several matters simultaneously: the formal dissolution of certain joint financial arrangements, the structure of an acquisition through which the Wentworth Consortium would absorb several failing elements of James's portfolio in exchange for operational continuity, and a preliminary framework for co-parenting. The financial arrangements were addressed first. Priya walked James through the terms methodically. The Wentworth offer was generous in a way clearly designed to communicate something beyond commercial interest, not charity, but the particular generosity of someone who had decided to be better than the situation required. James reviewed the documents without comment. His signature, when it came, was straightforward. Then Nadia spoke. "There is one additional requirement," she said, her voice carrying no particular emphasis, simply the tone of someone stating a fact. Before any personal arrangement between us can be considered, before I am willing to discuss co-parenting in any form that involves genuine collaboration, I need to see evidence of sustained, genuine engagement with therapy. Not a single report, sustained engagement over time with observable change. Eleanor Crane was watching James with an expression that was carefully neutral, but contained, Nadia suspected, considerable relief. "I understand," James said. "I also want to be clear," Nadia continued, "that I am not setting this condition as a door to a reconciled relationship. I am setting it as a floor for a functional co-parenting relationship. Those are different things, and conflating them will cause harm to all three of us, and most significantly to our daughter." "They are different things," James agreed, "and I am not asking for anything other than the opportunity to be a present and honest parent." The meeting concluded with signed commitments and a handshake that carried something of significance. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular respect that sometimes precedes it. In the weeks that followed, James began a more structured therapeutic engagement with a specialist focused on family dynamics and professional identity. He sent Nadia brief, factual updates at intervals she had specified. Not confessional, not performative, simply consistent. He attended the next scheduled medical appointment, where the ultrasound technician moved the sensor across the monitor and showed them the 4 chambers of a small heart beating with precise, reliable rhythm. James said nothing during the appointment, but Nadia, watching from the corner of her eye, saw the exact moment when something structural shifted inside him. Some internal architecture constructed against feeling gave way at last. What moved through his face was not sentiment, but recognition, the recognition of something real. He pressed his hands flat on the examination table and took a slow, careful breath, and Nadia looked away to give him the privacy the moment required.
Transformation, Nadia had come to understand, was rarely dramatic. It did not announce itself with a single defining scene. It accumulated in small, ordinary increments, in the quality of a Tuesday phone call, in the measured tone of a difficult email, in the 10-second pause before a defensive response that increasingly did not arrive. James worked with the methodical commitment of someone who had redirected the same focused intensity that had built his career toward the harder project of understanding himself. His therapist told him, in their 4th session, that the problem was not a lack of emotional capacity. It was that he had spent decades running an extremely efficient suppression operation, and dismantling that system would feel, for some time, like falling apart before it felt like becoming whole. He had found this unhelpfully accurate. He called Nadia on the day his therapist first used the word grief to describe what James carried in relation to his own childhood, the particular grief of someone never permitted to be uncertain in the presence of another person. He did not share the session's contents. He simply called and said, "I wanted to check in. How are you feeling?" It was such a simple question. He had almost never asked it during their marriage. Nadia, sitting in the Ashbourne Hall library with a book she hadn't been reading, considered it for a moment. "Tired," she said. "Good tired. The kind that means something is actually happening." "The baby?" "The baby and everything else." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "I was thinking," James said, "that if you were willing, I might attend the next appointment in person rather than by video, but only if you're comfortable." "Yes," she said. "I think that would be fine." It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was the gradual establishment of a new kind of trust, built with more honest materials, at a slower pace, with regular structural assessments. Ivy watched this process with the attentive concern of a person who cared about Nadia's well-being without agenda. She asked direct questions when appropriate, and withheld them when they were not. And she maintained a steady stream of unremarkable friendship, shared meals, long walks on the estate grounds, conversations ranging from consequential to entirely trivial that provided Nadia with the counterbalance she needed to the intensity of everything else.
Edmund, meanwhile, had begun volunteering stories about Nadia's mother with increasing frequency, offerings rather than explanations. Nadia did not press him, but she listened carefully, and gradually a portrait assembled itself. A woman of considerable intelligence who had chosen, above all things, to live on her own terms, and who had paid the particular price that choice sometimes demands. Nadia felt her mother's presence in these stories not as an absence to be mourned, but as a lineage to be inhabited, a way of being in the world that valued clarity over comfort, that met difficulty with deliberate attention rather than avoidance, that chose love not from necessity, but from genuine selection. She was beginning to genuinely understand what that meant in daily practice, and beginning to trust, cautiously and with entirely clear eyes, that she was now fully capable of living it herself. On a bright Wednesday morning in late February, with the countryside just beginning to suggest the possibility of spring, James arrived at Ashbourne Hall with a small box in his coat pocket and an expression that did not quite succeed in hiding the fact that he was terrified. Nadia was in the garden, walking the slow, deliberate pace of someone in the final weeks of pregnancy. She wore a heavy coat against the cold, her breath visible in the morning air. When she saw him coming across the lawn, she stopped and waited with a stillness that had become one of her defining qualities. He had been here twice in preceding months, once for a tour that Edmund organized around co-parenting logistics, and once for a quiet dinner that was stiff but honest. This visit was different. He had called ahead and been deliberately vague about his purpose, which Nadia had acknowledged without pressing. "You look nervous," she said as he reached her. "I am nervous," he said. It had become much easier to say simple, true things. They walked together along the garden path skirting the south wall, footsteps crunching on frosted gravel. The sun was low and clear, casting long shadows across the formal hedges with slow precision. "I need to say something," he began, "and I need you to hear it not as a negotiation or an attempt to restore anything that existed before, because what existed before was not what either of us deserved." He paused. "I was not capable of being the person you needed. I am still, in many ways, in the process of becoming capable of it. My therapist would confirm this is lifelong work, not a project with a completion date." "I believe her," Nadia said. "I am also in love with you, not with the version of you I thought I could manage, but with the actual person you are, which I only began to understand clearly after I lost access to you." He stopped walking. She stopped a moment later and turned to face him. "I know that love, stated simply, changes nothing. I know it is not sufficient. I know that you have built something real here, and I am not asking you to compromise it." He produced the small box. Inside was a ring, a single clear stone set in plain gold, catching the winter light with quiet, uncomplicated brightness. "I am asking whether there is any version of the future in which you are willing to build something new with me, not restored, new, with honest foundations and all the difficulty that requires." He looked at her steadily. "I will understand a no. I am asking anyway because not asking seemed worse." Nadia looked at the ring. She looked at this man who had, over recent months, demonstrated in small, consistent increments that his claimed transformation was real and not performed. She thought about her daughter, soon to arrive into a world Nadia was determined to make worthy of her. She took the ring from the box and turned it once in the light. "Yes," she said, "with conditions." "Name them," he replied immediately. "We continue the work, both of us. We treat honesty as non-negotiable, and we build this slowly, because slow is the only way it lasts." When he slid the ring onto her finger, they both stood very still, aware that they were standing at the beginning of something that had not previously existed. The island was small and private, recommended by a friend of Edmund's who described it simply as a place where the noise stops. The villa sat on a hillside above a turquoise cove, its open architecture designed to dissolve the boundary between interior and sea. 4 weeks after the birth of their daughter, Clara, a name that had suited her with immediate conviction, Nadia and James arrived for what Edmund had insisted on calling a proper beginning. Clara was with Ivy and a nurse at the main house, sleeping the extravagant, committed sleep of the newly arrived. Nadia stood on the villa terrace in the early evening, watching light change on the water, feeling with rare clarity that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. James came to stand beside her. The weeks since Clara's birth had altered him in ways difficult to articulate but unmistakably real. Parenthood had done something to the remaining architecture of his controlled exterior, not demolished it, but humanized it. He moved through the world now with an attention directed outward rather than inward, and the quality of his presence had changed from strategic to simply present. "I keep thinking about the gala," he said. "Don't," Nadia said, not unkindly. "I mean, I think about the version of me standing in that ballroom and I barely recognize him. He was making decisions based on fear and calling it control, and the distance between what he thought he was protecting and what he was actually destroying was enormous." "People do that," Nadia said, "including me. I stayed for 2 years in something that wasn't working because leaving felt like failure, and I had made failure mean something about my fundamental worth." She paused. "We were both operating from stories that had nothing to do with the reality in front of us." He reached for her hand, and she allowed it. The sea below moved in its steady, unhurried rhythm. "I want to be different for her," he said. "Not perfect. I am done with the aspiration toward perfection, which I now understand was always about control rather than quality, but present, honest, the kind of parent who models the willingness to be wrong." "That's exactly the right aspiration," Nadia said. They were quiet for a long time, watching the last light dissolve into the water. Later, they sat together in the open living room with the sea breeze moving through the curtains and talked with an ease and honesty that had never been available to them before. They talked about Clara, her expressions, her extraordinary certainty of her own needs, the way she seemed, even at 4 weeks, to be assessing the world with deliberate curiosity. They talked about what it meant to start over, not as a second chance at something previous, but as a first chance at something entirely new. That distinction, Nadia had come to believe, was everything. As the evening deepened and stars became visible above the cove, Nadia leaned back and felt, with the completeness that follows surviving something genuine, that the long arc of the preceding year had arrived somewhere worth arriving. Not at resolution, life was not structured toward resolution, but at ground solid enough to build on. Clara would grow up knowing both parents as real people, imperfect and committed and honest about the distance between who they were and who they intended to become. That, Nadia thought, was the most useful inheritance she could offer. She closed her eyes and listened to the sea.